Welcome to the US Latinx archival methodology. We are very grateful to Carla Barger for the invitation to participate in at the University of Illinois digital conference on getting started with digital humanities. It is an honor for us to be part of this important endeavor by the University of Illinois in Chicago. Today, the usLdh team will be presenting together. And so my name is Gabriela Baeza Ventura. I usually go by Gabi. My colleague, Carolina Villarroel, who with me are co-founders of the Center or the Space for US Latino Digital Humanities at the University of Houston. Our brand new postdoc, Linda Garcia Merchant, and our former postdoc, who is now a fourth member of our usLdh team, Lorena Gauthereau. The agenda for today looks as follows. Carolina will be talking about the Recovering the US Hispanic Literary Heritage program. I will speak about the Digital Humanities program, usLdh. Linda will talk about public humanities and the Latinx practices. And then Lorena will talk about Omeka and Timeline JS samples.
So I'm gonna talk a little bit about the Recovering the US Hispanic Literary Heritage program, because this is the base for all the work that we've been doing with the US Latinx Digital Humanities. And this is the Recovery Project. It's an international program that was founded almost 30 years ago by a group of scholars who recognize the need of creating an alternative archive that will recover, preserve, and make available all the written legacy of Latinas and Latinos in the US from the colonial times until 1980, something that had not been preserved at the archives, the traditional archives, particularly because they were produced mainly in Spanish, but also because it belongs to a minority within the United States. The recovery program has compiled an extensive bibliography of materials, pamphlets. We recover everything and anything that was published by Latinas and Latinos. That means literature, history, cookbooks, etc., etc. We have thousands of books in our repository, archival items, ephemera. We have an extensive microfilm collection and newspaper collection, hundreds of thousands of microfilm and digitized items, photographs. So one of the components and how the program started doing the research, and this is something that I would like to mention also, we work with the research assistants. These are graduate students from different departments at the University of Houston, especially from the Hispanic Studies department. But we also welcome students from the history departments and women's studies, etc., etc. We work with also with undergraduate students, and during the summer, we work with high school students, introducing them about the history of Latinas and Latinos in the United States and giving them the opportunity to participate in programs and projects and creating knowledge around this material. So one of the big tasks of the program at the beginning was creating a record of all the materials that were produced by Latinas and Latinos in the United States. And we did that going back and visiting city by city, state by state, trying to locate everything that we could find was produced by Latinas and Latinos. And that means everything that was written in Spanish, but not necessarily. Latinos and Latinos were also publishing in other languages, like French, Ladino, etc., and English, of course. We compile a bibliography of more than 20,000 records, and that keeps growing all the time. This big bibliography includes everything that I mentioned before, books about art, about education, etc., etc. So one of the big collections that we have of the program are our collection of newspapers. Latinos and Latinas produce a lot of knowledge and culture and literature through newspapers. It was a way to communicate in the community because it was very difficult to publish books. So this is one of the main places where the community could not only communicate politically, culturally, but also to connect with different intellectuals throughout the United States and abroad. So we have a collection at home of more than 1,400 newspapers in microfilm, digital format, and some of them in actual paper, which is very difficult to find because the paper used for newspapers, it was very acidic. It is very acidic. So these newspapers are disappearing really fast. So we are in a race against time to try to locate and preserve everything that is out there in terms of newspapers. We sometimes, when we're lucky, we are able to incorporate a whole run of a newspaper, but mostly we have some issues in some cases, and sometimes we were just able to recover a piece of a newspaper, which is really sad. So considering that the first newspaper published in Spanish in the United States was El Mississippi, published in New Orleans in 1808, we know there is a lot more out there that needs to be recovered. And these newspapers touch every aspect of the life of the Latinas and Latinos in the US. So we have newspapers, political newspapers, for example, the newspapers from the Mexican Revolution that touch on both sides of the revolution. We have newspapers published by women. La Voz de la Mujer is in the slide, and Feminismo Internacional, published at the beginning of the 1900s. We have a big collection of anarchist newspapers, more than 100 anarchist newspapers. And just to show you the kind of materials that we've been recovering in this sense. We also recover collections. We received collections throughout our board members. We have a list of board members of more than 40 scholars all over the country and abroad. And when I say abroad, it's important to mention too that we have partnerships with different countries to be able to recover these materials. For example, in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and other countries, because some of this material travel. It's some of the exiles coming into the United States, independence movements that were forged in the United States, they produce materials here, the intellectuals produce materials here, and then they go back to their countries, and sometimes they take the materials with them, or they left the materials here in the United States. So we try to complete the history of both countries, giving back to those countries the materials that stayed here, or and exchanging information with them. So in terms of collections, well, we have scholars, recovery scholars, we call them, that do research on archives, and family archives, and historical associations, and they bring materials back to us so we could preserve it and make it available to everybody, to use it. So one of the collections that we think that really represent the work that we do, that is kind of this detective work that we do here at the program, is the Leonor Villegas de Magnan collection. Leonor Villegas de Magnan was a Mexican woman living in Laredo, Texas, who by the time of the Mexican Revolution decided to create a group of nurses. So she put together a group of Anglo women, Mexican-American women, and Mexican women to fight on the revolution on the side of Carranza. So we're talking about a transnational figure, and that was very active during the Mexican Revolution. And at the end of the Mexican Revolution, she decided to write her memoirs because the accounts of the Mexican Revolution didn't include women. And aside from the generic Adelitas and Soldaderas, this is a really interesting and important fact that this woman, Leonor, was able to write her memoirs and realize the importance of her importance in history, and the importance of recording her history and other women's history during this historical moment. She hired a photographer. She wrote her memoir in Spanish. Nobody wanted to publish it in Mexico. She rewrote the memoirs in English, and nobody wanted to publish it in the United States either, because it's, again, the account of a woman writing about a historical moment, right? So by the time our times, one of our board members was able to trace through the newspapers these memoirs, but to find out more about this treasure, she had to travel to the Netherlands to read the whole run of the newspaper. The whole run of the newspaper sent her back to Laredo to a family member. And we found out that the collection, with the photographs, the letters from with the Mexican, the most important generals of the revolution, were at her granddaughter's house here in Houston. So it was so close, but it took the trip and the knowledge of the scholarly work of this colleague, and to be able to find this material that as of now is the only memoir written by a woman that we know of about the Mexican Revolution. Something that is really important to mention is that we created databases around our work, these archives, the newspapers, et cetera, and we work with the REDEX and EBSCO to make available these materials to scholars all over the country. So you can find around 440 of our newspapers through REDEX. Through Arte, Público, Hispanic collections, and EBSCO, you can find thousands of the books that we have recovered, collections, and articles, indexed in English and Spanish. So if you're thinking about creating a project, this is something that I would really like to stress, is the copyright resources. So if you think about working or publishing something, just be very aware of copyright issues and the issues that you can encounter in working on materials that are post 1923, for example. So we wanted to share some information here. I'm not going to go into detail. You probably will have access to these slides later. So go over the information, and when you create or work on a project, think and remember about this that can create a big issue for you and for your research later on. I also added some copyright resources that you can consult later and to go back to this in the future.
Digital humanities for us, it's not something that is emerging. We, in fact, a lot of the work that the recovery has been doing for the past 26, 27 years has been at the forefront of technology. We have, from the very beginning, we have been digitizing, documenting the Latino presence in using the most important and technological advances that we had at our hands at that moment. And so, so when digital humanities started, making started making waves in the humanities world, by then we have been doing quite a bit of work. We didn't necessarily call ourselves digital humanists, but we call ourselves scholars, historians, librarians, who were doing something other on the side, because we had to figure out a way to document the history that was the Latino history that was not being recovered or incorporated into traditional archives or museums, or even if it was there, it was placed in spaces where it was not taken care of. It wasn't necessarily assigned to an archivist, and if whenever it was assigned to an archivist, unfortunately, those archivists, many of the archivists at that time, except for Maria Cotera, for example, for Marta Cotera, I'm sorry, many were not trained and knowledgeable about how to work with the archives of the Latino community. And so I want to make sure that we understand that this is work that has been ongoing. Now, what we have now is a space, a center that is extending the work of the recovery program. And I want to start by saying that we part from a position of social justice. And so for us, we establish a praxis that whenever you work with US Latino materials, we have to think about the work of scholars such as Emma Perez, who invites us to think about how we have to be writing, we have to think about ways about how to rewrite our history, and how we are really endowed with the agency to rewrite our history, to rethink ourselves within these spaces that have left Latinos out of them. So all the discourses, literary discourse, the historical discourse, and she invites us to write from that perspective. And so I give this quote here from her book, The Decolonial Imaginary, and I also invite you to visit our website at Arte Público Press, because we have an ongoing Sotero bibliography that lists a lot of the writers and theorists and scholars on whose shoulders we stand as we think and process these materials from an academic perspective, and also from a community perspective. Because one of the things that we do at the Recovering the U.S. Hispanic Literary Heritage Program in the US Latino Digital Humanities space is that we think of digital humanities not as a process that is complete with the community, with the subject matter that we're working with. We think of those subjects, of those materials, as exactly as subjects. We think of them as elements that are producing knowledge. So if you read the work by Maria Cotera, for example, in her Chicana praxis, she also invites us to think of them in that way, and not necessarily as items that are just giving you the knowledge and you're taking the data and producing something with it, and then you just forget them and put them back in the archive. That's not where we part from. I'll go back one quick slide, just so that I can also tell you what we understand digital humanities to mean. If you visit Amanda Visconti's blog on what is and what are digital humanities, she gives us a lot of important information about this field that is very contested, about what it means and how different people understand it. And so for us, it's a very practical way of looking at the way technology is. And so we take technology and we apply it to the digital, to the research question, and we start to question when these two things come together. It allows us to question the spaces in which the Latino community, the brown people, are not present. And then we also start to question why, right? And that allows us to reveal certain structural paradigms that are there that really demonstrate the erasure or the constant struggle, right, to erase our history out of these discourses. And so for me, this specific slide that she has in her publication is very useful, because it really puts things into a very visual and practical perspective. I'll give you a little bit of information about the space that we created. For us, it was important to secure funding. Thankfully, we were able to obtain a large grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and we're very grateful to them for that. That grant started out as a planning grant that allowed us to travel through the nation to visit different centers to see what the different work that was being carried out, and to see what types of scholarship and what types of activities were taking place in those centers, so that we could in turn model our own center after that. And so we eventually were able to apply for a larger grant that now has given us funding for 3 years to really fortify the establishment of a space that will extend the work that the Recovery Project has been doing. And so this space is now supporting development, support and training of digital humanities projects with a focus on recovered materials that live at the University of Houston, but also that live at other institutions. We want to make sure that people use the model that we produced at the Recovery Project, that the Recovery Program, and that they take that into their own institutions, that they investigate their own archives and the spaces within their own communities to find where those Latino materials are, or where or materials that belong to underserved communities, where they are, why they're not incorporated into traditional archives, etc., and to start interrogating that. And perhaps maybe that's the beginning of documenting that presence, and then beginning the early stages of a digital humanities project, which is doing the data collecting and the maybe digitization, and that way you start accumulating, right, amassing some of the data that you can eventually help into creating a project that will shed light on those materials. We also want to create a space for a digital publication. We just recently launched APP Digital, and this is done through Manifold. We also received a grant from Manifold for training and to secure a virtual space that would hold our first digital publications. So we invite you to visit our website and to access that so that you can see what those publications look like. These are also publications that fulfill the requirements that we usually have for Arte Público Press publications. Arte Público Press is the umbrella organization that hosts Recovering the US Hispanic Literary Heritage Program and USLDH. And Arte Público is the oldest and the premier Latino publisher of US Latino writers in the US. So, for example, we were the first to publish Sandra Cisneros, The House on Mango Street, Ana Castillo, for example. And so we follow the same standards in our APP publications through APP Digital. And lastly, I should also indicate that these digital publications are open source. They'll be shared freely with everyone. They have the capability for annotation. And so we invite you to visit them and to look to see if you can use them in your classes. They're they will be done bilingually. Then another key element for this USLDH space and the practice that we want to think about as you as you start thinking about working with US Latino materials is also to promote and foster interdisciplinary work. It's important for us so that we document the presence of other scholars doing this type of work, and also to demonstrate that this activity for a long time, we were told that we're working in silos, or that we're working independently, or there's no interest in US Latino material. But the reality is that there are many scholars who are doing this work, and maybe it's not necessarily the work that they're doing for their tenure track portfolio. But once we start seeing that many more people are doing this type of work, then it'll be difficult for at the institutions, right, to question whether or not this work is viable and important. One of a key element for this, and that is important right now to mention, is that we through the Mellon Foundation grant, we are awarding grants in aid in the amount of $7,500 to produce a digital project and a publication. And so we've awarded the first 7 for last summer, and so we just published the call for the next grants in aid projects, and we'll be sharing that with you at the end, or you can access that through our website. And then we also want to create this communal virtual space where these projects are shared, and this knowledge is shared on Latino Digital Humanities. All of these elements are present in our Arte Público Press webpage and under Digital Humanities. And the last one is to establish a Latina or Latino DH hub. And for that to us, it's again to become following on the tracks of what the recovery has been doing to document the presence of Latinos and the scholarship and the different publications that have existed here in the US. that really allow us to document the presence and make our community visible. We feel that also we need to have document the footprint in Latino DH that our community has been making. So we on our website, you will also see a document that lists the various digital humanities projects that exist to date on Latinos that we know of and that people have shared with us. So as we work on our digital humanities projects, and as you begin to work on some of these projects, and of course, when you think about this, this praxis does not only lend itself to think about the Latino community, but also on any underserved community. Always ask yourself, how do you approach, right? How are we approaching this US Latino experience? And this is very important to ask because it allows us to understand our privilege and perhaps the different views that we will be applying, or the different maybe prejudices that we will be looking at, you know, that will govern the way we will be looking at some of these material. And also if you will have, and if by this time you have read, you will have read Chicana Praxis by Maria Gauthereau, you'll be reminded of thinking about about how the data that you're using will have to be able to participate with you as part of the research team, right? So that data does not simply become an element of your research or you know, an object within your study, but rather it is an element that is producing knowledge along with you, as you may be writing about it, but that subject that you're working with is creating this knowledge for you as well. And so we see ourselves as tools, right, that are using our voice, right, to extend, to give voice and to give to allow these archives to speak for themselves. How do we understand the importance of ethnic materials in the U.S.? So also thinking about the importance of these materials within the United States and the role that the United States has assigned to them. And so a lot of times we think of these materials simply as materials that will, you know, diversify, you know, a collection. Well, if that's we have to ask ourselves these specific questions so that we understand whether or not we are honoring the way, you know, the communities that these materials represent. Important question on language. For us, it's extremely important to use languages, Spanish especially, but if there's other languages other than English, we also have to figure out a way to contend with that, because a lot of the materials that Latinos produced in the US were produced in Spanish. There's a lot of materials that were produced in English, of course, but you know, unfortunately, because a lot of the newspapers that were published in Spanish were written in Spanish, they were not incorporated into archives, and so that's the reason why many of them have been lost. So there's a way also to interrogate how language has been used to erase our history. Carolina talked a little bit about copyright issues. So how do we create meaningful and respectful data? So we need to really think about what the data is telling us, and try to understand it within the time when that data was created, how it was archived, how perhaps that archive is organized. And although we cannot go back in time, we can certainly go back and understand the history, the events that were taking place, and perhaps if you look at some of the examples that Carolina gave you of some of the newspapers, why don't we have a complete run of certain newspapers, and why are some of them missing? Well, it's understanding that some of that data was not cared for correctly, and also because of the way that it was preserved by the community that eventually was able to share it with us. how do we work with community owners of the knowledge? This is extremely important for us because as in recovery, we have always practiced post-custodial praxis. And what that means for us is that if a community member wants to share an archive with us, a lot of times they will approach us and they'll ask us about, you know, giving us their archive or seeing if we're interested, if their archive is important. A lot of times they understand that their archive is valuable, but they don't understand why or how. They just understand that it's valuable. And because a lot of times in traditional archives, a lot of times Latinos have not been present. The Latino community doesn't see themselves represented in them, and so they think that maybe their archive should not be part of a traditional archive, and or they know that if they give their archive to a library, for example, where there may be like there are a number of Latinos or no Latinos, that their archive might be lost. And a lot of people really want their archive to be shared with other community. They want to have visualizations. They want to have somebody do research on their projects, on their archives. And so we offer them the opportunity to, we always help them evaluate their archive, help them understand that their archive is important. And also we provide various alternatives for them. So we can, we will always digitize the archive if they're okay with that. And we give them a copy of the digital archive. And if they want the original archive back, we give it back to them. Because for us, it's a matter of preserving that archive. It's not a matter of us owning that archive. Now, if they do want us to take ownership of the archive, we put it in special collections at the University of Houston. Because we do believe that these archives need to be part of an institution that should be responsible to the community for preservation and for making these archives available to other people in the community as well, and not just through us. And so once the archive comes to us, we immediately start thinking about different projects that can be done with the archive. So as a press, a lot of times we first think about the publication of a book, if that's available. And then in terms of digital humanities, we start thinking about other ways in which we can visualize the archives. And that is why later on, my colleagues will talk about the three strategies, or two of the main strategies that we have used to visualize. One, which is Omeka, and the other one is timeline. And then how do we create knowledge and scholarship based on these materials? We have approximately 40 to 50 board members that are who are members of the recovery board, and these scholars cover the different fields from library studies to history, sociology, Spanish, language, etc. And these scholars are often creating knowledge. We also train graduate and undergraduate students. We have approximately 20 dissertations that have come out of the work that our students have done, and also through the Grants and Aid program that we have had over the years. When the recovery first started through a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation, we were able to award about 150 grants. And lastly, we are one of our most important aspects of the work that we do is that we work full circle with the community. So it's for us, the research and the scholarship that we practice is not a scholarship that is top down from academia to the community. It's reverse. We work with the community. We try to make sure that the materials, that the scholarship that we are producing is scholarship that can be ingested by the community. That is why the data, the platforms that we use, the software that we use, platforms that the community can then take ownership and reproduce their own versions of the materials that we're doing. So we also teach our community how to use some of these how to use some of these software so that they can use it for their own purposes. So for us, the community is an essential part of the work that we do, and so these questions will help you guide the work that you're doing, and specifically if you're thinking about working with US-Ldh materials. And I'll pass that on now to my colleague, Linda.
So thank you, Gabby. So Gabby's been giving you a wonderful insight into the work that we do at US-Ldh, the work that we've been doing at Recovery with Carolina's opening. So I'm going to talk a little more broadly about public humanities and how we think about public humanities and then what makes Latinx digital humanities different, or at least unique, maybe not different. So the way we're defining this understanding of public humanities is that projects presented to the public that are produced institutionally, often broad in scope, and collections that articulated in some way to reflect a subject significant to a discipline, which of course recognizes the value of the material produced by the subject, which then offers up a value-added scenario for future research. Let's see, the second thing would be collections that represent an event, an issue, or circumstance, also well documented from traditional sources, like second wave feminism, like Gloria Steinem's collection at Smith. The second thing is accessibility, curated collections of archival materials. So subject materials are collected to reside in a place, right, accessible with permissions to certain communities. For example, I, as a student of a university, have access to special collections within my library system. If my university belongs to a consortium, Big 10, Big 12, ACC, SEC, PAC-10 or PAC, I will also have access to those libraries. But if I'm a legacy scholar, a community activist, or someone with no ties to the institution, do I have the same access to these collections? With public funded collections like the Smithsonian, the Library of Congress, local public library holdings, I have more access as a card carrying, library participant member of public library, concern. For example, a number of museums in Chicago have special collections, some of which are available to non-institutional scholars. But how aware are we of this access? If you are a community member or a legacy scholar or someone just interested in a period of time or a subject famous to Chicago, like Ida B. Wells. The Newberry Library, the DuSable Museum, the National Museum of Mexican Art, and the Chicago History Museum have very different protocols about access and use. Do we know them? Not really. And that is one of the ways that we, understand access to public collections or collections within institutions. There isn't access. We don't have an immediate accessibility outside of the academy. So, and Gabi alluded to this a minute ago in the way we approach the work here at US-Ldh, but the whole idea of top-down knowledge. Collections within institutions come to the archive embedded in a political structure reliant on a value and value-added model. Familiar subjects, faculty, popular figures get precedent. The more people know these people, the more value they have. The traditional model assigns value to a collection based on its existing relationship to the archive or the discipline. The more scholarship that has been done about a person makes them more relevant within the academy, within the discipline. So there is more of an interest, or there is more value applied to that subject, that collection, those materials. So what happens is you have this sort of feedback loop that happens that Maria Cotera talks about. I know Maria's kind of a foremother to our work, but the Cotera family in general. So that you have this loop of materials being produced around a subject or a topic that continue to create the value of that subject or topic. If there is any other material or subject relevant to that topic, are they as addressed? Probably not. Which leads me to the finite nature of collections. So in the traditional model, collections are received, ingested, cataloged by Library of Congress subject with Dublin core descriptives and offered via some iteration of a finding aid. So I visit an institution with a collection on a subject. I view materials that exist individually on their own, often with no mention of reference to other materials. So, you know, objects in a vacuum. The assumption is that there's a traditional scholarship on this subject that will ground me enough to translate what I'm looking at, to offer answer to the questions I've arrived at to explore in this collection, and will create those connections. So in other words, there's enough scholarship that has already been produced about this subject because it is interesting and it is valuable and it is available, that I won't need a translation of any sort in the form of an annotation or in the form of some sort of curated experience to answer the questions that I am coming to this collection with. So this allows materials within a collection to live within a vacuum. There's enough information about the subject, external information about a subject and their relationship to a field, both personal and professional, to inform a collection. In other words, I don't need any more information about those artifacts or that material within that collection because there's enough that's been written about it. So what about collections that haven't been written about? Well, they're not in the archive because, so you see how that's sort of a loop? So the other issue with public humanities projects is that they are sometimes community engaged, but not often community controlled. Is there space in the collection for materials that don't fall into this value-added category of the recognized name or scholarship? If collections are accepted that are not or cannot be grounded in the literature of a discipline, how then are those materials described? When materials are accepted from a community, the dialogue with the community is often unidirectional. In other words, collections are ingested, defined, and stored, reflecting the colonial protocols and limited knowledge of the academy about the collection. The community is proactive and the resources are available that include some understanding of the post-custodial materials. There will be a richer definition of metadata, but not necessarily of subject identification. And I bring up subject identification at this point because one of the things that Lorena is going to talk about is how we do adapt that. Again, there is the last issue of money. So institutions have support for, or some support for collections. Well, often there's private donations. So, you know, there's a whole conversation around this, around the collecting process that is directly related to money. A library gets a collection, a significant one, or even a significant one to a community that understands its significance. The Academy is already approaching its financial situations about increase as decrease. So calls for diversity clash head-on with calls for austerity. So collections have to be ingested, identified, and categorized, but not necessarily digitized. That isn't often an option that doesn't require an additional grant being written. Another task on the overlong due list for archives or librarians who are less inclined if the value of a collection is not immediately recognized. So these are kind of the challenges we have when thinking about public humanities and when thinking about public humanities projects. So the difference with Latinx DH from this whole concept of a top-down model of traditional ingestion of collections is that our projects begin with relationships and networks that, again, Gabi and Gabriela have done a really wonderful job of describing here. But we do begin with community, understanding the value of the contribution that occurs with the subject and the object and the experience of both, together, connected, reflected within students who are experiencing the process of digitizing materials, with interviewing subjects if they're still alive. Building community means building a network of participants that includes both subjects and practitioners in a multidisciplinary approach to the accumulation of knowledge, collecting the object and data and building the resource. Networks don't just apply to the community being collected. Networks include the technological needs of collections, archivists, writers, media specialists, and technologists helping to create and support the community collection. Culturally representational persons add a language and focus to the building of a sustainable model of collection. Because remember, it isn't just about collecting, it is also about maintaining those collections. We center community-based knowledges and experiences. All knowledge is equal. All knowledge has value. All contributions are both sound and important to the collaborative production of a collection. Often our projects are led by scholars with an understanding that each practitioner and subject will have productive insights into the vision of the project. All voices matter, especially in projects that highlight contributions that have been neglected or silenced. There's also a collaborative ethic of giving back. The relationship of the subject and the practitioners to the collection is bidirectional, allowing the contributor to share the history and purpose of an object, the specifics of a life story, and the practitioner to articulate that knowledge, not just in terms of media or cultural production, but in terms of infrastructure. How we actually access that information, how we're integrated into the process. The relationship of the subject and the practitioners to the collection is bidirectional, and that's very, very important. It is a conversation. And in that conversation, there is this transgenerational knowledge exchange that occurs with storytelling. But it's who's telling the story, who's witnessing the story, who's articulating the story. Students, scholars, practitioners, subjects, the material, all come together in this knowledge exchange as a witness of students who are trying to then articulate this witness within their own, from their own transhistorical and transcultural lenses. So it's this whole multicultural, multilingual scene of exchange and production that transforms and doesn't duplicate the digital record. Students and researchers are given the opportunity to cultivate new knowledge. And in this way, the archive is not a static space of storage, but a dynamic one of, as Maria Gauthereau describes, encuentro, or encounter, where the observations of each generation commenting on their specific contributions of labor can be seen often as annotations to material or curations of work, where their themes are discovered that may not have been present in the archive alone. The archive then becomes, again, this living place of discourse between the practitioners, the subject, and the public. Non-traditional methods of articulation that engage the community, thereby creating a sense of permanence and belonging. Storytelling is one thing, but what does it mean to tell the stories of a community of people and places that immerses the audience in the content, situating them in the time, space, and place with meaning? Which leads me to access and precarity. Again, as Gato and Gabi have mentioned, there are moments where we are in a race against time. Materials have not been preserved in any kind of a way, and we're in a rush to have this post-custodial sort of triage moment to collect as much as we can about a history that we are very, very involved in. So building community, so access and precarity, access, accountability, and precarity then becomes our responsibility, because we are living in these spaces of loss of materials, of loss of stories, of loss of history. So building community means understanding the importance of an ongoing, often permanent relationship with a community to the archive. The most important element of this is access to the materials, the articulation, both public and private, of the work. The active participation in outreach and education of that same community to the archive's relevance to it. Here, the scholar in the institution can provide the active role, helping find a home for the materials, a long-term home for the actual materials, helping to interrogate the post-custodial materials within the classroom space. And again, this goes back to the whole idea of accountability. The donations that we are given in terms of these collections, we all understand that they are gifts. They're not just artifacts or data. It's the transformation. They are gifts that create these transformational moments of witness that each practitioner experiences with their own interaction with this data. The collection for all participants to its cultivation becomes our group responsibility to produce. It creates in each one of us a sense of cultural obligation to record, document, curate, and ultimately give new and unique voice to material for moments that resonate in their universality. And so I'm going to turn this over now to Lorena to talk a little bit about the samples of work that we are doing and how this is actually happening at USLDH.
All right, so I'm going to give a few examples that we feel really exemplify the use of two specific platforms, Omeka and Timeline, but I do invite you to visit our webpage, artepublicopress.com, and navigate to Recovery Program, where you can see our menu that includes digital humanities and a listing of our digital humanities projects. So you can see a few more projects that use the archive in different ways and visualize the information using different platforms. And so this one is from our Omeka collection. You can actually find it at usldhrecovery.uh.edu. And this is a collection and an exhibit that uses the Leonor Villegas de Magnon collection, which Carolina mentioned at the beginning. One of the important things about these projects is that they start with the archive, and then we find it important to contextualize rather than just put the images out there without having the historical or linguistic context. And this one specifically was created by our HCC colleague, Melinda Mejia. That's the Houston Community College. And so we have scholars, we have staff at Recovery, we also have students at different levels of their academic career that help, so that they not only get to work with the archive itself, but they also learn how to create metadata, how to describe these archives, how to do the research around it, and how to best describe them in ways that make sense and connect to the community. And just what, connecting to what Linda said, the whole point is to tell stories in a way that is respectful of the archive, and that is also telling an accurate and representative story from the perspective of the archive, right? Not trying to appropriate. One of the things that is really important for our archive is that it is multilingual. And so we want to make sure that we represent the Spanish language in a way that increases searchability. And rather than limit ourselves by the Library of Congress subject headings, we also create Spanish language Spanish language tags or keywords that help people find the documents that they're looking for. It gives different or multiple ways of entry to find the documents. This is the Omeka collection is available and accessible by the wider public, so not just academics. We try to describe these documents in both the metadata and in the exhibits in a way that is accessible to people not just within academia, but K through 12 through the community. Because one of the things we find is really important is that we want our community to find the cultural representation that is reflective of their history when they Google themselves, when they get online and do a search for example, Latina. We don't want them to find stereotypical, over-sexualized hits on the internet. Instead, what we're doing is trying to populate the web space and use that web space as a space of resistance where we can really push back on the canonical or kind of curriculum of US history and to show a more varied, truthful history that reflects our community involvement. So this is another example. This is also on the Omeka page. This is an exhibit on the artist and social activist and poet Ángela de Hoyos. It was created by a graduate student named Valentina Jaeger, and she worked with Gabi on this, and also had a lot of freedom to do research and to really focus on what she felt was important to highlight. And so she decided to write this bilingually, so that there's a Spanish version and then an English version. And she was really thinking about who the audience of this exhibit would be. Now, this is actually another exhibit on the same historical person, Angela de Hoyos. This is also a student exhibit. This one is actually created by an undergraduate at Rice who came to recovery at UH to fulfill a cultural heritage class credit. And she wanted to focus on the art aspect of Angela's collection. And so you see that there's various ways to enter into this collection, to explore it, to tell different stories about the same collection. And then we also use timelines. So we partnered with LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, which is the oldest and longest lasting Latino organization in the United States that was created to ensure the civil rights of Latinos. And what we thought was really important was to focus or to highlight the chronology, this long, important history of social activism that LULAC has carried out since 1929. And an undergraduate actually did this research and created this interactive timeline. So not only did she gain training in the digital tools, but she also learned how to do archival research and how to be part of this collaborative team that was in the university, but also connected to LULAC in the community. And now I'm going to turn this over to Carolina.
Thank you, Lorena. So just to comment on this community engagement and work with LULAC, a few years ago, we received a collection from the family members of Alonso Perales. Alonso S. Perales was a civil rights leader, an attorney, and who was fighting for the civil rights of Mexican Americans and Latinos and Latinas in the United States.
And so thank you everyone for your contributions, Lorena, Carolina, and Linda, for your participation in this presentation on US Latinx praxis and archival praxis. I hope that we were able to give you a really good understanding of how to think about, what to think about as you embark in a digital humanities project that deals with the US Latino community and archives, and understand that these practices that we're discussing are transferable to other communities as well. And I think one of the most important things for us is coming from this, the perspective of respect, and to understanding that the work that we're doing is really standing on the shoulders of not only of academic work that has been done by other scholars, but also by other scholars of color who have not had the opportunity to or whose work has not been cited because they have been working on work with underrepresented communities, or Black, Brown communities, Latino communities. And so I think it's important to understand that as well. I included this slide at the very end just to remind you about who we are as a usLdh space that we created. I invite you to look at our website, artepublicopress.com, to get more information about the grants in aid that we announced. There's the announcement has recently been made for the next cycle of grantees that would be available soon. And lastly, we invite you to use the hashtag usldh.com if you come around any digital humanities project that brings together US Latino and digital humanities. because we would like to document the presence of that project or that initiative in the data set, in the database that we've created and that lives on artepublicopress.com under digital humanities, under the digital humanities section. This is a way in which we continue to document the presence of Latinos in the US. We thank you and we look forward to talking and having questions from you in a week from now. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.